everyone, today I'm going to be drawing with you based on your responses. The other day I asked on Instagram what you would like to see me draw for this art process video, and you can see the responses on the screen. I actually did other sketches beforehand that I'll show at the end of the video, but this is the one that I settled with. When I'm making my sketch, I usually envision what I want to see by the end of this process. So basically I'm thinking about the finished product already. So for the most part during this sketch, I'm going to be focusing on anatomy and composition. Those are some fundamental skills in drawing, so those are important to practice. And of course, I have some references I'm looking at as I'm coming up with this pose in particular. For this, I was looking at that one Mikasa shot in, I think it was the second opening for Attack on Titan. So I always think it's usually a good idea to keep a few references on hand while you're working on the sketch. I usually would like to have a really solid foundation before you actually start getting into rendering, so nothing looks funny or out of place. I also tend to have a habit of sketching out the characters or subject matter first before working on the background. I usually build the background or environment around that character. So when you're working on the background or environment, it's good to keep in mind what kind of lighting or what kind of atmosphere you would like to give to your character. So, for example, in this sketch, I'm planning to have this as an indoors environment. The reason for this is because one of the responses, or a couple of the responses, had mentioned certain lighting. I remember someone asked for maybe light that shines through the blinds, so that's what I'm going for. I remember another one suggested some intense lighting. So these are things to keep in mind while you're making the sketch so that you're prepared for the actual rendering. So I don't think I have anything else to add to the sketch process, so I'll leave you with this time lapse and then I'll check back in for the line work. So the sketch is just about done, so we'll be starting with line art now. Before I actually start doing the line work, you want to lower the opacity of the sketch layer and then make a new layer for your inks. The reason for this is that I know some artists complain about accidentally drawing on the wrong layer, especially during inking or line art, because they end up drawing on the sketch layer. The thing you can do to avoid this is by lowering the opacity, since once you draw on a layer that's a lower opacity, you immediately know that's the wrong layer. So just a little something to keep in mind. Now for the actual inking process, I like to use a very pressure sensitive brush like the one you're seeing me use right now. And I usually do it in black ink, but sometimes if I already have a background colored in, I usually do some neon colors like red or blue, just so that it's easy to see the line art against a darker background or something like that. This usually depends on which I do first, because sometimes after the sketch I'll just create the background first, but right now we're doing inking first, so that's why I can keep it as a black ink. The pressure sensitive brush you really want to take advantage of, because I just think that having thin lines and thick lines have a really nice natural fluid feel depending on how you use it. You usually want to think of shadows during this time, especially like maybe, as you can see, under the neck or jaw and under the nose and inside the ear. Those are usually the places where I create little hash lines to create a bit more depth. I usually want to keep my line art as loose and flowy as the original sketch. Thinking back to that one meme of not liking your line art as compared to your sketch. I'm not sure if I have any tips for that, but I guess the best thing I would say is to be loose with your line art and don't be afraid to mess up, because if you mess up, you can just erase it and try it again. It's okay to redo a few lines over and over again until you're satisfied with it. And it's also good to keep in mind that not every line needs to be perfect, because most people will just look at one artwork, maybe a few seconds, like a quick glance. So the main idea for line art would be to keep things loose and flowy, but also keeping it clean and neat for your viewers. I'm going to let this time lapse play out, and then I'll talk again soon during the coloring. The line work is just about done, so now we're going to be moving on to flats. So I only have about maybe a couple thoughts on coloring and flat colors. Mostly the fact that I don't really want to stress too much about getting the exact color right, The reason for this is because we're going to be rendering over that and changing that color anyways, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Another thing about doing flats is that I almost never use a pure white or a pure black color. Instead, I usually take the color from the background and then make either a very light version of that color or a very dark version of that color. You can also see here the downsides of doing very loose and flowy line art. This is that I don't close my lines, so I'm going to have to color all of these in manually instead of using the fill tool. So I'm going to let this time-lapse play out until all the flat colors are filled in. Now that the flats are all colored in, there are a few extra steps that I take before I add an atmosphere. The first one is duplicate the line art layer and then add a Gaussian blur. So once you have a duplicate line art layer that is blurred out, I change that layer to a burn layer. And the second thing that I do is making a new multiply layer and adding some warmth to the skin tones. So usually I'll just select the flat colored layer, then go onto the multiply layer and use a small or medium-sized airbrush. Usually we think of big gradient shapes and then brush on some warm color, usually a reddish tone. So after I merge together the burn layer, the flat color layer, and the multiply layer, this is where I usually work on the background for a bit. At this point, I'm ready to add in some atmosphere and shading, however you want to call it. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. I never really stick to one particular way, but I usually would utilize the multiply layer or the overlay layer. Either one could work depending on what kind of mood you want to use. So for this piece in particular, I do want to create a dark, serious sort of atmosphere. This would be where you would see me play around with a lot of colors and shades. This point in rendering, or shading I mean, or atmosphere, I don't know. This would usually be the point where you see me play around and experiment. I usually try to think or keep in mind what would make the greatest effect when someone sees this for maybe 1 or 2 seconds. So that's usually what I'm keeping in mind. That's also what I think about when I'm doing lighting or shading, as you'll see in just a minute. And by greatest effect, I mean the greatest impression. So you do want to try to make your artwork stick in someone's mind. That's what makes a strong impression. So a lot of these things I would usually be thinking about the shape and movement and how it looks overall. So that's usually why I try not to zoom in too much, other than small details that I think are usually important. It really depends. So right now you can see me doing the lighting process. For this piece I'm doing it by erasing parts of the multiply layer I created beforehand. So there's nothing much to say about lighting other than know where the light source is. You can see I'm doing a pretty interesting lighting, since one of the responses said to try doing light that shines through the blinds, so that's what I'm going for. And of course I do have a reference for the lighting to help me out. You can have a reference for anything really. It just helps you keep on track and make the most accurate lighting or drawing. The same goes to shading as well. I try to keep things pretty simple for shading. I do like making big dramatic shapes, and of course details are still important, but what we're focusing on is the bigger picture. So with that, I'm going to let this time-lapse play out, and then I'll talk again soon when we're near the end. So I'm about done with shading the characters, so now it's time to start finalizing this overall piece and try to tie it together to make it look like one holistic artwork, if that makes sense. So right now I'm just fixing up the background a little more to make sure it has a little more texture, and then I start doing more multiply layers and a color dodge layer, as well as white highlights. So for color dodge, we are going to, it's basically a big airbrush of light, so we're going to brush on some color dodge where the light would be hitting. In this case, it's at a very nice focal point between the two characters. So for this piece, I think I actually changed the color dodge layer quite a bit, and I think I actually settled on a big airbrush, a big white airbrush to indicate a gentler light. And now we are adding in some pure white hard highlights. So I'm using the same brush I used for line art, but instead I'm using white ink. And another lighting trick that I like to do is duplicate either that white highlight layer or the colored layer of the characters. I'll duplicate those and then I'll change the entire hue into white, and then I'll apply a Gaussian blur to create a really gentle light that communicates the character's silhouette very well. And of course sometimes I use a soft eraser to maybe pick and choose which parts I want to see glowing, if that makes sense. So sometimes I'll do just the character silhouette, or sometimes I'll do just the white highlights, or I'll do both. And at this part of the art process, you might see me experimenting with some hues or shades or light, but it's all part of deciding which parts of this piece you want to keep and which parts you think would be better off not being there. But the general idea is to make this whole piece a really impactful piece of art. And right now, I think I've been doing a lot of lighting during this part, but soon, I think later down the art process near the end, you'll see me finish it off with a multiply layer of a cool toned hue, since this is the type of color scheme we're going with. And I'll brush that multiply layer with an airbrush along the edges away from the opposite side of the light source. So that would create a lot more depth and vibrance. So now, once we're happy with our overall piece, it is time to do the final touches. So what I'm going to do is save this as a PNG, and then open that PNG in Krita again, and then I will apply a Gaussian blur for the whole overall piece. And what we're going to do is erase part of that Gaussian blur starting from the middle out, so that the sides are slightly blurred and it gives the viewer more focused on your subject, like these characters near the middle. So that's a little neat effect that I like to use to create more focus and a sense of bringing this whole piece together. And since this is a fake screenshot, or kind of a fake screenshot, I added a few subtitles for fun, just to complete the look. So thank you very much for making it all the way to the end of this video. I know this wasn't the best explanation, but I hope I'll do better commentary if I ever make more art process videos. So thank you again, and have a good day.